So, meet Carol Morgan, a 36-year-old mother of two who ran a grocery shop in the quiet English town of Linslade, Bedfordshire. Carol was well known around town, kind, hardworking, the type of person everyone trusted. She managed the shop alongside her husband, Alan Morgan, a man who, on the surface, seemed like an average guy. But beneath the surface, Alan wasn't exactly the husband of the year. Turns out, Alan had a little side project, a long-running affair with a woman named Margaret Spooner. And when I say affair, I mean the kind of relationship that could have fueled an entire season of a soap opera. While Carol juggled her family and her business, Alan was sneaking off to see Margaret, leaving behind a trail of whispers and suspicion. The people in town were starting to notice, but Carol, she kept going, focusing on her kids and her work, likely hoping things would blow over. Until one day, August 13th, 1981, to be exact. While Alan took his stepchildren to see a double feature at the Odeon Cinema in Luton, Carol stayed behind at the shop. It was a normal evening, until it wasn't. Sometime that night, while Carol was in the storeroom, someone attacked her. It wasn't just a quick strike, it was brutal. She suffered multiple injuries from what investigators believed to be an axe or a machete. It was overkill, the kind of act that screamed rage or premeditation, or both. But here's the kicker. Whoever did it tried to stage the scene as a robbery gone wrong. They took £435 in cash and some cigarettes from the store, making it look like the motive was theft. Nice try, right? When Alan returned home from the cinema, he walked into a nightmare. Carol's body was in the storeroom, the shop was a mess, and the town of Linslade would never be the same. When the investigation began, all eyes were on Alan. Sure, he had an alibi, movie tickets, witnesses, the whole shebang. But his affair with Margaret Spooner was no secret, and police couldn't ignore the glaring motive. Still, there wasn't enough evidence to tie him to the crime, and the case went cold. Years passed, and Carol's murder became a haunting, unsolved mystery that left a stain on the town. But secrets have a way of bubbling to the surface. Decades later, this case would come roaring back to life, with revelations that would shake Linslade to its core. The murder of Carol Morgan left Linslade haunted, a grim shadow hanging over the town for decades. Police had combed through every inch of the evidence back in 1981, but nothing stuck. With Alan Morgan's alibi rock solid and no witnesses to place him, or anyone else at the scene, the case hit a dead end. But just because the trail went cold didn't mean people forgot. The whispers about Alan's affair with Margaret Spooner never really died down, and locals couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. By the time the case was reopened in 2018, everything had changed. New forensic tools, modern investigative techniques, and, most importantly, a willingness to dig through old secrets breathed new life into the investigation. Bedfordshire Police's cold case unit was determined to give Carol the justice she deserved, and it didn't take long for their persistence to pay off. Enter Jane Bunting, a name that had never come up during the original investigation. Jane, just 17 years old at the time of the murder, came forward with information so explosive it shattered the quiet cover of the case. According to her, Alan Morgan had approached her shortly before Carol's death with a chilling proposition. He asked if she knew anyone who could get rid of his wife. Not exactly the kind of conversation you have over tea and biscuits, right? Jane's testimony was a game changer. It painted a picture of Alan as more than just a husband with a wandering eye. This was a man willing to cross the ultimate line to rid himself of a wife he no longer wanted. But Jane wasn't the only piece of the puzzle. Investigators began to uncover a pattern of behavior from Alan that suggested he'd been planning this for some time. And then there was Margaret Spooner, the woman at the center of this deadly triangle. Margaret had always denied any involvement in Carol's death, insisting her relationship with Alan was separate from whatever happened that night. But suspicions about her role had never gone away. Was she just a bystander in Alan's alleged scheme, or was she actively involved? As police dug deeper, they uncovered inconsistencies in Alan's alibi that hadn't been noticed back in 1981. Sure, he'd been at the cinema, but new witness accounts suggested he may have slipped away during the films, long enough to orchestrate the crime or, at the very least, ensure someone else carried it out. Piece by piece, the investigation began to paint a picture of a man who was not only unfaithful, but also calculating. He stood to gain significantly from Carol's death, both emotionally, clearing the way for his relationship with Margaret, and financially. By the time Alan Morgan was arrested in 2023, more than 40 years after the murder, the case against him was stronger than ever. But even as the trial loomed, questions remained. Who had physically carried out the attack on Carol? And how far had Alan gone to cover his tracks? The arrest of Alan Morgan in 2023 sent shockwaves through Linslade, reigniting decades-old questions about the murder of Carol Morgan. But even as Alan sat in custody, the investigation was far from over. Prosecutors had built a solid case against him, but one critical piece was still missing: the identity of the person who physically ended Carol's life. Alan was the alleged mastermind. But who swung the axe? During his trial, the prosecution argued that Alan had orchestrated Carol's murder to clear the path for his future with Margaret Spooner. They presented evidence of Alan's financial struggles and his affair, painting a picture of a man desperate enough to eliminate his wife to start fresh. The testimony of Jane Bunting was a key piece of the puzzle. Her account of Alan's chilling request to get rid of Carol painted him as a man willing to take extraordinary steps to achieve his goal. Margaret Spooner, though never directly tied to the crime scene, found herself thrust into the spotlight. While Margaret maintained her innocence, the prosecution suggested she stood to benefit from Carol's death as much as Alan did. Witnesses came forward with anecdotes of her relationship with Alan, describing their closeness and their whispered plans for the future. But without concrete evidence linking Margaret to the murder itself, her involvement remained speculative at best. Alan's defense team, meanwhile, doubled down on his alibi. They argued that he was at the cinema with his stepchildren during the time of the murder and that there was no physical evidence placing him at the crime scene. They painted him as a man whose infidelity, while morally questionable, didn't make him a killer. But then came the forensic evidence. While advances in technology couldn't pinpoint the killer, investigators presented details from the crime scene that painted a picture of careful staging. The cash stolen from the register, the cigarettes taken, it all screamed premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a carefully calculated act meant to mislead investigators. Ultimately, the jury didn't buy Alan's claims of innocence. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, he was found guilty of conspiring to murder Carol Morgan. In July 2024, more than 40 years after Carol's tragic death, Alan was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. The courtroom was a mix of relief, sadness, and lingering uncertainty. Justice had been served, but the story still had holes. Margaret Spooner was acquitted of all charges due to lack of evidence, leaving many to wonder whether she had truly been unaware of Alan's plans or if she had simply outmaneuvered the justice system. As for the person who physically ended Carol's life, that remains a mystery. Despite decades of investigation, no one has ever been charged for the actual attack, leaving a chilling question mark over the case. The murder of Carol Morgan stands as a grim reminder of how betrayal and greed can destroy lives. Not just Carol's, but those of everyone involved. It's a story of love turned sour, secrets that refuse to stay buried, and the relentless pursuit of justice, even after 4 long decades. Thanks for watching, and if you're as fascinated by tales like these as we are, make sure to stick around for more.